Hi, folks, and welcome to all our guests who are attending today and to our panelists. I'm really glad you're here. We're still welcoming folks into the webinar, so we're going to give it a couple more minutes before we dive into our topic this morning. But again, I just want to say thank you all for being here, especially to our panelists. We will be using the Q&A function today. So if you have questions, just put them in the Q&A as they come to you. Welcome to folks who are just arriving in our session today. We're going to give it a couple more minutes before we get started. Let's see, I'm getting a message saying the link that's sent out is wrong for Zoom, which, let's see here. Natalie, do you have any idea what that's about? I mean, we do have some people joining, but.
Yeah, I'm concerned. I will look and see what's happening.
Okay, great.
But we do have some people, we have 15 people in right now, so I'm not sure what's happening, but please also note that we are live on Facebook, and that can be accessible for anyone, and the webinar link is in Facebook as well. So if you are on the Facebook event, you can click the location link and that should send you straight here as well. But I am going to resend our thank you for joining us email right now, just to make sure there's no issue.
And there. Natalie, we're getting some comments in the chat. Thanks to you guests who are clarifying that folks came in through the meeting ID because the link had an error. That's what folks are consistently saying. So, okay. Yeah.
Then I will resend the email right now. Thank you.
Everybody's so good at bearing with these technical Zoom difficulties. We've gotten used to it. I appreciate everybody's patience. I appreciate the folks who have shown up. And we'll get started as soon as Natalie sends out that link and we can get more people into the webinar. Welcome to our guests who are just joining. As you probably noticed, if you tried to click on the link this morning, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Natalie Cunningham, our outreach director, is sending another email to people who registered that will hopefully get more people in the room. We're just going to give that a couple minutes before we get started. I see that a few more guests are trickling in. Thanks for bearing with us through our technical difficulties this morning. We're going to give it a couple more minutes so that we can get more people in the webinar before we begin.
Okay, that link has been resent to the group that signed up for the webinar.
And Natalie, do you know that link is the right one?
It's the entire invite from Zoom. So if Zoom's wrong, then we're off. Then okay. People need to go to Facebook.
Okay. To folks who are trickling in, thank you for bearing with us through some technical difficulties this morning. We're going to give it another minute or two before we get started. I want to make sure as many people are in the webinar as possible before we start hearing from our guests. Maybe not as many as possible, but at least give them a couple more minutes. All right, I see those numbers ticking up. So I guess that means that the new link we just sent out is working better for folks, which I'm really glad about. Welcome to all of you guests today. We'll be using the Q&A function. So if you want to communicate with us, if you have questions, please pop them in there as they come up for you. I'm our host for today's conversation about race equity and state policy, how 2021 General Assembly issues affect Kentuckians differently based on race. I'm really excited to have the guest experts with us that we do today. Many of you already know that this is the second session in our conference that's comprised of 4 sessions. Next Friday at the same time, we are going to be talking about sentencing policy, and then the following Friday, our last session for the conference, we'll have our guest today, Dustin Pugl, our senior policy analyst, host a session about economic security in the age of COVID. So again, welcome to all of you today. I'm glad you made your way into the webinar, and I apologize again for the technical difficulties. So while each of our conference sessions explore race equity and use that lens on the issue at hand, we wanted to create one session that illustrates why none of these inquiries are one-off endeavors. Systemic racism requires a systemic approach to equity in all of our policy conversations. So today we're going to use that systemic approach to discuss 3 of the biggest policy issues that are in play in the 2021 session: criminal justice, safety net, and budget and tax policies. I'm your host again. I'm Anna Baumann, Deputy Director at the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy. And I'm going to introduce each of our panel guests before their presentations, and then moderate the question and answer session portion, the discussion portion, towards the second half or the end of our panel conversation this morning. So again, please use the Q&A to share your questions, and you can pop them in there as they occur to you, and then we'll come back to them later. Guests on Facebook Live, you can also put your questions in the comments, and our outreach coordinator who is monitoring those comments will pop those questions over here onto Zoom for us. We want to make sure that everybody is included in the conversation. Also, if you are watching on Facebook Live and would like to join us on this webinar, the link is in the Facebook event page, and I'm hoping that's the right link. So, because we've had trouble with links this morning, but I'm sure you'll let us know if that doesn't work. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce our first panel guest this morning. Pastor Edward Palmer is Senior Pastor for Sign of the Dove Church International in Radcliffe, Kentucky. And he's a certified diversity trainer working to eliminate disproportionate minority contact in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. He is chair of the National Coalition for Juvenile Justice and serves as a certified police chaplain, among many other ways he lives out his calling. He is recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award presented by Governor Bevin and the Courage for Kids Award from Kentucky Youth Advocates. And full disclosure, Pastor Palmer also brings his vision and commitment to justice to KY Policy as a member of our board. Today, he will connect the big picture on why a race equity focus is so critical with his priority bills in the 2021 session. And before I pass it over to him, I'm going to pull up a slide that he asked me to share. All right, Pastor Palmer, you should be able to speak to us now.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for the great introduction. I want to thank KY Policy for this opportunity. And I want to thank all of my co-panelists for their participation. in this discussion. And I kind of want to be part advocate and part preacher. So if some of my comments sound like a sermon, just go ahead and feel free to type in amen. I was sharing in one of our preliminary meetings, and Anna shared with me that, she felt like she needed to yell amen at a couple points. But I think it's important, and the reason I have this slide up during my presentation, because, in 2020, we dealt with the trifecta of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery. And so I think it's important to look at what happened in 2020 and talk about how that affects what we're currently experiencing right now as a country, but also end with some talk about legislative priorities for 2021 session. In the first 8 months of 2020, 164 Black people were killed by police. On May 25th, the world watched as George Floyd spent the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of his life begging for mercy as a police officer rested his body weight on his throat. But the immediate 3 months following George Floyd's murder, we had another 288 police killings in this country. And of those 288 police killings in the 3 months following George Floyd's murder, 65% of them were people of color. So I want us to think about that. After witnessing the polarizing event of George Floyd's murder, dealing with what's happening around Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rashad Brooks, all of this is taking place. And while this is taking place, another 288 folks killed, and of that amount, 65% were people of color. So when we talk about disadvantages and the disparate treatment that minority populations experience in systems in our country, I'm just going to walk you through a few data sets just to kind of drive home the point that people of color deal with an accumulation of disadvantages. When we talk about socioeconomics, according to the Federal Reserve, the median net worth of Black households is nearly 10 times less than that of white households. According to the Census Bureau 2018 report, the median income for Black households is about 60% less than that of white households. And then according to the US Department of Labor, their April 2020 report, African Americans had the highest unemployment rate in this country among all racial groups. The poverty rate for African Americans is 21% compared to just 8% for their Caucasian counterparts. So when we think about wealth and we think about wealth distribution in this country, understand something, there's a big gap between the wealth of African Americans and Black and brown people compared to their white counterparts. COVID-19 has really exposed the public health disparities that Black people experience. Nearly 10% of Blacks lack health insurance in this country compared to just 5% of the majority population. Black people make up 13% of the US population, and yet they're 23% of the COVID deaths across this country. And when you look at our urban centers, in some centers, there's 70% or better of the deaths as a result of COVID-19. Whites account for more than 60% of the US population, and yet they account for 53% of the COVID deaths. The mortality rate for African Americans is about 137 per 100,000 folks, compared to 60 for Asians, 97 for whites, and 100 for Latinos. So again, we see this disparate impact of COVID-19 on African American people. In fact, African American and indigenous people are 2.5 times more likely to die of COVID than their white counterparts. So again, we see this health inequity. And I think it's important that we look at this conversation around inequity on multiple fronts. One of the things that I've had the privilege of talking with my co-president, Dr. Cherie Dawson-Edwards, is about this cumulative effect of disadvantages on minority populations. COVID-19 exploited that in a way that was very deadly for minority folks. A couple of weeks ago, Dr. Edwards and I was on a panel together. We actually moderated a panel together. And one of the things we talked about, and the reason I wanted to bring up the opening picture, we talked about the difference between acute compassion. The world responded to the trifecta of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. And we're very good at responding in an acute way to these polarizing events. But what's needed for this conversation and to really move an anti-racist agenda forward is chronic empathy and passion, so that we might bring forth real and sustained change. So let me deal with a couple of things that I've heard in my travels around the country. And the first thing I want to deal with is this: I'm not a racist defense, right? I do a lot of diversity training around the country, and everybody's trying to defend themselves from this label of being a racist. This I'm not a racist defense. This defense will not move the nation to a place where racial inequities are part of our history and not a part of our present reality. So that defense will not move us to the place we need to go. And when we intentionally and aggressively identify and eradicate systemic policies, systemic racism in the form of policy, then we can make that statement, one nation under God, a reality for all people. So we've got to get out of this individualized perspective, I like to call it that myopic view, and really start to look at the broader impact of public policy in this country. And so I want to talk to you and just motivate you to think about some of these polarizing events as public policy failures and not individual acts, right? So in Georgia, the justice system's initial response to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery was a public policy failure, right? We oftentimes think about this father and son duel that murdered him, and everybody's attacking the two of them. But the criminal justice system's response was a public policy failure. In Kentucky, the invasion of Breonna Taylor's home that resulted in her death, that was a public policy failure. And rather than just attack the police officers, we need to really deal with the systemic impact of policies that allow for this kind of thing to happen. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, that police officer that murdered George Floyd in plain view of the whole world, that too was a public policy failure. The public policy response to Black Lives Matter, I mean, let's think about this now. The response to Black Lives Matter protests, again, was a public policy failure. And then we witnessed last week an attack on our nation's capital, where the attackers, quote unquote, protesters, didn't quite look like those involved in the Black Lives Matter protests. And again, that was another public policy failure. So this I'm not a racist defense doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. It's the public policy that allows for disparate treatment of Black and brown people that matters the most. Not the individuals that carry out these acts, but the public policy that shelters them, that protects them, that allows for these things to continue happening. Dr. Martin Luther King said, it may not be true that the law cannot, he said, it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And that's pretty important. And I agree with Dr. King. We've got to have a conversation about the impact of public policy. Racism is about the policies that govern our public life. It's not about the individuals who may or may not be a racist. It's about the public policy that governs how we interact with one another, how police interact with Black and brown communities compared to how they interact with white communities. Anti-racist policies will identify and eliminate racist individuals. You want to get rid of those few and far and few in between racist individuals that may be in our institutions? Well, develop anti-racist policy. It will control the behavior of those would-be racist individuals. Simply put, it's about the rules of the game and not the players of the game. Another phrase I want to deal with is this idea. I've heard this since last week. You guys may have heard this as well. When they stormed the Capitol, I heard this as a result of the American version of a coup. That's what happened last week. It was the US version of a coup, right? It resembled something in a third world nation. The guy we wanted to win didn't win, so we overtake the government, right? And so subsequent to that event, I've heard a lot of folks say, this is not who we are. This is not who we are. And then I begin to think about that, and I have a question. If that's not who we are, then who was that at the Capitol? Who was that? Another question I ask, can we be better than the public policies that govern our public life? Can we be better than that? So if that was not who we are as Americans, then who were those people that stormed our US Capitol last week? Are they not a part of the collective we? Were they not veterans? Were they not police officers? Some state legislators? Were they not school teachers, school psychologists? Olympic gold medalists were among them. Firemen, CEOs, moms, dads, grandmoms, and granddads. Who were they? They were Americans. They were a part of the collective we. So if that's not who we are, then are Gregory and Travis McMichael, the father and son duo that killed Ahmaud Arbery, are they not a part of we? If that's not who we are, is Derek Chaffin not a part of the we? A police officer that killed George Floyd before our very eyes? Is Rashad Brooks, the black man shot by police in Atlanta? And that's a whole nother story, shot by police in Atlanta. When we think about how we move these resources around. Shot by police in Atlanta while running away. Is he not a part of the we? Sandra Bland, is she not a part of the we? Michael Brown, is he not a part of the we? Trayvon Martin, is he a part of the we? Tamir Rice, is he a part of the we? Is the Central Park Five a part of the we? So this thing is about policy. This is about changing the rules of the game to create the equitable outcomes that we all say we want to see. It's not about individual players, because policy will control the behavior of the individuals who serve in our system. We've got to change the rules of the game. So that was my sermon for the day. But I do want to get into some policy. And before I get into some policy around juvenile justice, some specific bills that I think are promising for the road ahead, I want to highlight some things from Senate Bill 200, juvenile justice reform of 6 years ago. Since Senate Bill 200 went into effect, we've seen the diversion rate increase from 58% in calendar year 2014 to 72% in 2019. We've seen the diversion eligibility rate for public offenses go from 55 to 63%. We've seen status offenses, the diversion rate go from 67 to 91%. 91% of the kids who commit a status offense end up in diversion, not in court, not in our detention centers. We've seen our county attorney decreases, overrides of diversion decrease by 50%. In Louisville, Kentucky today, we've got a total of 22 kids in detention. Not in Louisville, but across the state. 22 kids. Now, Cherie, you can remember when that was in excess of 100 kids, right? And so we've greatly reduced the amount of kids getting to the back end of our system. But here's some good news about some of the things happening in, let's take Jefferson County, for instance. In Jefferson County alone, we've seen in the last couple of years, we've seen the county attorney override drop 92% for Black kids. That's down from 905 diversion overrides all the way down to 74. as a result of some very intentional work. So a lot of great things are happening as a result of Senate Bill 200. We've greatly reduced the amount of kids getting to the deep end of the system. We've closed 3 of our state funded juvenile detention centers. And then you add to that Louisville Metro closing its detention center. We've got far fewer kids in cages today than we had in cages 5 years ago. But a few bills I think is important for us to keep our eyes on as we move through this legislative session is SB 36. And I'll list the main authors of those bills, but there are others who have signed on. Senator Westerfield has filed this bill, and this bill removes this automatic transfer from district court to circuit court. In other words, move a kid from being charged as a juvenile to being charged as an adult. This removes that automatic transfer and allows a judge to look at each case and the merits of each case and the mitigating circumstances of those cases and determine whether or not a kid should actually be moved up. This is going to go a long way to address racial and ethnic disparities at the YO transfer point. Right now in Kentucky, over 50% of the kids that are YO eligible and that are referred to adult court are African-American kids because of this automatic transfer piece. So this is a very important bill to addressing racial and ethnic disparities at the worst end of our juvenile justice system. And then Senator Neal filed SB 40, which requires a racial impact statement on all bills related to criminal and juvenile justice. I love this bill because what it says is before we make a bill law, let's look at the impact and let's determine whether or not, really this equates to putting a racial lens on that bill and determine whether or not this bill is going to have unintended consequences on certain populations. And if so, then we can modify that bill to create equity before we pass it. And then SB 60 is a bill by Senator Meredith, which removes the death penalty. And I don't know how much traction this will get, but from a juvenile standpoint, it doesn't do a whole lot because I can't remember the last time Kentucky has sentenced a juvenile to death. However, this bill allows for a life without parole. And so that's the real meat of this bill is how do we get life without parole removed from a juvenile offender? More than 50% of the kids in this country serving life without parole are Black kids. And so this is a big concern that we address this over sentencing of youth in general, but definitely the impact on minority youth. And then Senator Gibbons, SB 10, and it has several other co-sponsors, but SB 10 creates the Commission on Race and Access to Opportunity. And this commission is going to be looking at all things racially disparate and look at how do we begin to address racial and ethnic disparity on a broad policy scale across the state. And so I think that's a very promising bill as well. And then on the House side, HB 126, filed by Representative Massey, is simply a bill to remove the threshold of felony theft from 500 to 1,000. I think Kentucky is one of 3 states that still have that very low threshold of 500. By moving it to 1,000, we're hoping again that we minimize how many folks are going into our jails and prison systems as a result of this kind of low-level crime. And then there's House Bill 86 by Stein, and this prohibits the use of solitary punishment as a disciplinary tool. Again, this will affect both the use of solitary confinement for young people as well as for adults. So I think on the juvenile side, we've got some great bills coming forth to begin to address some of the racial inequities. I talked with Senator Westerfield as recent as yesterday, and I know he still plans to drop a bill we've attempted to get passed 3 times that intentionally addresses the racial and ethnic disparity within our system of care. So I'll end with a quote from Napoleon. The world suffers a lot, not because of violent or bad people, but because of the silence of good people. Thank you.
That's an important charge for all of us, for our audience today. Thank you so much, Pastor Palmer. Actually, I had one question. When did SB 200 pass? Did you say that?
Yes, in 2014.
It's just such a good testament to the power of good policy to change outcomes for people and remove barriers. So thank you for sharing that and all that you did. Our next guest today is Dr. Cherie Dawson-Edwards. Dr. Dawson-Edwards serves as Associate Dean for Diversity, Engagement, Culture, and Climate, and is Associate Professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Louisville, where she also directs the College of Arts and Sciences Social Change Program. She holds a PhD in Public Policy and Administration from Virginia Commonwealth University and a Master of Science in Justice Administration from U of L. Her research and teaching interests center on the intersection of public policy and criminal justice, with a specific focus on race, schools, and juvenile justice. She has held positions in probation and victim services, is a national board member for the ACLU, and serves on the executive committee for the ACLU of Kentucky. Dr. Dawson-Edwards is also recipient of the 2016 College of Arts and Sciences Community Service Award. So again, it's my honor to introduce you, and I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Of course, nobody wants to be the next speaker after Pastor Palmer, but I will attempt to do my best. I also just want to hold space for people today. You know, I think that our country, we are living in interesting times that seem to change daily, you know, weekly or daily. And so I just want to hold space for that. And I also want to hold space for grace. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And I know that we've all learned to give each other grace in this last year of virtual worlds. So let's make sure I have this together. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Yes. Grace. It must be Pastor Palmer. You prayed for me, Pastor Palmer, so I could get it together? Okay. All right, so I am here to the criminal justice related talk. And so I appreciate Anna's introduction and my bio. But I just want to talk a little bit about something that a lot of people don't hear me talk about. I've been a criminal justice professor for almost 20 years, which means I teach a lot of different things. This semester, I'm co-creating, not co-teaching, but co-creating a class called Police, Protest, and a Pandemic. And so the brief talk I want to give today is related to the things that me and my co-creator, who is a recently former LMPD officer, an alumni from my department, and also one of my former students, we are teaching this class, and everything that happens every day just about changes what we're going to talk about in our class. So when I was invited to this panel, I thought I would kind of frame my talk around what I've been delving into so much for creating this course. So the title of my little talk is, what does community safety look like? I think we spend a lot of time, I know we spend a lot of time talking about public safety and these, you know, converging or diverging ideals about what public safety means. And, you know, since the Breonna Taylor incident came to light, and I live in Louisville, so, you know, I'm in ground zero of it, then there have been more and more conversations on what should reimagining public safety. And I've been struggling a lot with the term public safety, because I'm not sure that public safety allows the community to actually hold public servants accountable. That model is not allowing for that. And so I've been favoring the term community safety, because I believe that people who live in communities should be able to have voice in what makes them feel safe. And that people who don't live in those communities do not understand what that community feels would make them feel safe. So I'm going to take this from the lens of living in Louisville in 2020 and 2021 starting the way that it did. You should see that there's a picture on this opening slide, and I don't know if many people know who that is. I can't see a chat feature to say, tell me if you know who that is. But I think I want to hold space for this woman. She was the first African-American police officer for the Louisville Police Department in 1922. Her name is Bertha Wedby. In 1922 was a long time ago. We are in 2021. It was almost 100 years ago, right? And the reason that I put her on my opening slide is because I think when we talk about racism and anti-racism and systemic racism, when we see what appears to be progressive movement, we act like that doesn't exist anymore. Like there aren't issues because we see that. Well, this was the first Black police officer in Louisville almost 100 years ago. And clearly we still have issues with justice and needing justice reform. So I know a lot of people don't talk about her. So I thought I'd put her name out there so we can see that we did progressive things 100 years ago, and look at where we are today. And then I wanted to draw attention to this particular excerpt from George Wright's book, Life Behind a Veil. And I won't read the whole thing, and many of you might have read the book or know a little bit about it. But this quote from Professor Jackson says, that there are two cities in Louisville and that there are two Americas, and that Black folks often feel like we are behind a veil, and there's this world that everybody thinks is the same for everyone, and it's just not. And so, I just think that this quote is very powerful, and reminds us that oftentimes people feel like they're living in two Americas or two Louisvilles or two Kentuckys, and that we have to be mindful as we address systemic and structural racism, that we are empathetic and compassionate towards people who have different lived experiences than us. And again, that goes back to my whole concept of public safety versus community safety. There are plenty of people that feel like the police protect them, that makes them feel safe. There are plenty of people who feel like the police do not protect them and that it makes them feel unsafe. And so those are two divergent viewpoints, but they both are real, right? And what we have to move away from, I think Pastor Palmer was talking about chronic empathy. What we have to move away from is believing that only my world view is real. And so when we make policy decisions or proposals, then we must consider that just because this is the way things they are for me, that is how everyone feels. And when it particularly is important when we talk about safety and justice in our country. So let's see, my slide wasn't working. So I think the idea of two Americas kind of was thrown in our face last week, right? And there's been a lot of conversations comparing January 6th to the summer and the protests. And I don't know if you all saw this article in the Washington Post, but they did a really nice job of comparing two dates in Washington, D.C., a June 1st Black Lives Matter protest versus the January 6th insurrection on our U.S. Capitol. And so they compared the two. And when you read comments, which I hope nobody does, but I sometimes go down the rabbit hole of reading comments on social media, you can clearly see that people look at these things so differently, and so, when we talk about how we're going to address racism in our society, we have to come to some racial reconciliation, right? We have to reconcile these differences. We have to reconcile the past with the present, so that we can have a better future. But I mean, just looking at these two pictures and some of the discussions I've had with people with opposing viewpoints, people really see these things as different in different ways, and we have to be able to come to a space where we can talk about them together and move forward from it. There is another concept, and I don't have a slide on it, but I do want to talk about it because I think it definitely pertains to our state, and particularly Louisville. And this is another concept that George C. Wright wrote about in one of his books, and it's called polite racism. And I don't know if you all know very much about the Midwest and polite racism. And I know that in Kentucky, we don't all associate feeling like the Midwest, but Louisville feels a lot like the Midwest. And other parts of the state, my dad is from far Western Kentucky. It feels a little bit more Southern, you know, so we have different cultures depending on the geographic, you know, space we hold in this state. But polite racism is a form of oppression that extended a few concessions to African Americans as they accepted their place and remained at the bottom of society. And so the reason I bring this up is that I think that as long as we accept our place, then it's okay. But the minute we say absolutely not, we won't stand for this. This is not fair. This is not right. We are treated differently. We want to be treated equitably and fairly. Then that is where we get some of the responses that we've gotten particularly in this last year. So I want us to be mindful of our polite racism in Kentucky and how our viewpoint. Is it because Black people have not necessarily always stood up, or to the extent that we did in 2020 and our allies did in 2020? Is that a result? Is your response to that a result of polite racism, or what is it? So I think we have to investigate our biases and our perceptions to make sure that they're not rooted in racist ideals or biased perceptions. So one of the things that people say when we talk about justice reform and thinking about reimagining what community safety looks like is that, oh, but we have to do these things to curb crime. And much of the data says that violent crime is not a determinant of police violence. And so I have this chart. I know you can't see it very well, but it has cities at the bottom, and then it shows police killings, the number of police killings as it relates to their violent crime rate. And so levels of crime in US cities do not determine rates of police violence. So I think when we move into talking about some of the other things that I want to talk about, like the militarization of the police and the rise of the warrior cop, people think, oh, it's because, violent crime is so bad. And there are places, and Louisville's one of them, where violent crime is bad, but the correlation is not there. So you don't need tanks because there's violent crime, and so I just wanted to put this out there because people like data, even though I'm more and more, even as a researcher, I more and more don't care about some of the data because we know the data is just going to keep showing us the same thing. And I know that doesn't sound like something that will come from a professor who gets grants to do research. But at some point, we've got to stop saying, well, we need proof. We don't need proof. We need answers. There's been enough proof. Like Pastor Palmer and I have worked on juvenile justice reform for, gosh, what did we say, Pastor Palmer? 14 years, 12 years together, I believe. And the data, I mean, there was some promising data with, the magnitude and volume of youth, but the disparities are still there. The disproportionality is still there. So we don't need any more data to tell us that Black and brown youth are still treated differently in our system in Kentucky. So as we move forward and talk about what community members are talking about, what people are talking about, what policymakers are talking about, what the constituents are talking about as relates to reforms, when we talk about real systemic change, then these are some of the questions that people are asking. Are proposed reforms allocating more money to the police? Are proposed reforms advocating for more police and policing under euphemistic terms like community policing? Are the proposed reforms primarily technology focused? Are the proposed reforms focused on individual dialogues with certain cops? And so these are more of your local changes, but you can also extend this out to state level policy suggestions as well. And then I like these graphics. This is actually from Canada, but they have a really cool graphic that talks about reimagining community safety. And it says, I'll just highlight the top parts. Listen to the police. They want to focus on actual law enforcement. Listen to economists. Our prison system is an industrial complex. Listen to doctors. We can help people to contribute to society. And it talks about the health, the relationship with health determinants and things like that to crime and justice. And we forget that. Like, we don't talk about that a lot. We talk, just police. No, there's all these other things that impact how justice works in our society. And it's not just the actors in the justice system, it's the other social issues and social problems that are part of our community and are woven into the fabric of our country that have to also be fixed. So when people start thinking about empowering community safety and alternatives to our current models and the way that we produce justice in this country, then there's an ongoing collection of data on proposals across the country. And there's a website, and I can certainly provide that for anybody who wants it. And they keep track of proposals for change. And so some of the leading things, of course, are reinvestment, reallocating funding and reinvesting in communities and other organizations to do some of the work the police maybe shouldn't be doing. And then, thinking about accountability, demilitarization, public safety alternatives, transparency, and then union. So this was probably a month or so ago. I'm not sure how much the percentages have changed, but largely across the country, people are proposing reinvestment or divest and reinvestment ideals. And so I thought that would be an interesting chart for people to see what people are, doing across the country. So I do want to talk a little bit about the militarization aspect, because I think visually we saw a lot of that this past year when we saw the way that the police responded to certain protest-related events. And so, I'm not going to go into my class history, like I would in my class about the history, but the 1033 program is the program that made surplus military equipment available to state, local, and tribal law enforcement at no cost. One of my former colleagues from EKU wrote that military equipment will lead to higher levels of aggregate police violence. And he defined it as the embrace and implementation of an ideology that stresses the use of force as a means to solve problems. And so one of the books that I would recommend people reading if they want to know more about this is a book called The Rise of the Warrior Cop. And so we can see how that happened over time, that it wasn't just, 1997, the 1033 program happened, and all of a sudden we have military equipment. No, like there was this cultural change in the way that the police viewed themselves and the way they viewed themselves in our communities that led to this. And so I always, when I think about the militarizing the police, I think about this picture of this young Black woman in a sundress, in flat sandals, and the police officers in the garb that they have on, and she has nothing. She has nothing. She does not appear, to me at least, to be very much of a threat. So I bring that up because I think if you've been paying attention to the news, then you know that, Representative Lisa Wilner and Representative Attica Scott recently announced 3 pretty important bills that respond to the 2020 that we had, particularly in Louisville. House Bill 244 directly addresses some of this militarization stuff. It wants to ban law enforcement agencies from receiving such military surplus equipment. It wants to require de-escalation and crisis intervention training for law enforcement that is equal to the number of hours of deadly force training. And so if you're going to provide deadly force training, then also provide the same amount, if not more, I would suggest, for de-escalation and crisis intervention, and then clarifying the use of rubber bullets, tear gas, and long-range acoustic devices, and then, of course, outlawing the use of kettling, which if you go to Representative Scott's Facebook page, she talks about how she's experienced all 4 of these things as a peaceful protester over the last year that we've been dealing with the things that we've been dealing with in Louisville. And then another set of bills that I think, or in addition to 244, is 245. And 245 clarifies the it's lawful to record, live stream, or photograph the police in public. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, I have the picture of the 502 live streamers that lots of people have followed during the course of this year. I initially wrote on these like, why do we need that? Why do we need to clarify that it's lawful to record, live stream, or photograph the police in public? Because it's absolutely not questioned that is the law. While the Supreme Court has never done a case specifically about this, almost all of the circuit courts and lower level courts have ruled that this is legal, as long as you're not intervening in police activities, as long as you're not doing it secretively, as long as you're not impeding an investigation, then it's absolutely lawful to record, live stream, or photograph the police in public. And the courts have ruled it as a First Amendment right. That includes the right to freely discuss our government and the right of freedom of the press and public access to information. And so I just find it interesting that we need legislation like this. And I don't disagree that we need it, but if we know that that's true, and we know that, and the police know that, the fact that we need legislation to outline and clarify it just further illustrates the discord or disconnect between communities and the police. And then HB 246 is clarifying riot and unlawful assembly language. It clarifies the definition of rioting to mean a group of 5 or more explicitly engaging in harmful or destructive acts. So explicitly engaging in violent or harmful and destructive acts. And so it's providing more definition and parameters to that law so that it won't be used arbitrarily, discriminatorily, and vaguely applied to situations that probably really aren't rioting or unlawful assembly. I did not find a bill filed yet, but I know that there is talk that there may be legislation that is anti-protesting in the sense of restricting protesters from being in certain spaces. And so I'll be looking out for legislation that might curb protesting as opposed to legislation that may protect protesters. And then finally, I know my time is running out. It's a lot to talk about in 10 minutes. But I wanted to, bring up 2 bills related to me, police accountability. And a lot of people may not have seen this first one as a police accountability related bill. But this bill was pre-filed, but then it was rescinded recently. But I don't know if you all remember this, but it would have prohibited the electronic publishing, posting, reposting, or otherwise disposing of any personal information of all current, former, or retired law enforcement officials, including police officers, judges, and prosecutors and their immediate family. Pretty much instantly that was deemed in the civil liberties arena as it would be against the Constitution. So it doesn't surprise me that it was rescinded. But what surprises me that it was ever presented at all. And the reason that I consider this a police accountability issue is because the ability to publish the names of people who may have done, like Pastor Palmer, he just said somebody's name. He told us, he's repeated the name of the officer that killed George Floyd, right? If that was a law, he couldn't have done that, and we do that as a form of information, but not even that, but as a form of accountability. We know who you are. We know what you did, and everyone knows your name. Now, does that mean you should dox them? I don't know. That's up to somebody else. But the fact that you couldn't even say someone's name if they did something wrong, or even if you just thought they did something wrong, was, a restriction to me on holding public law enforcement officials accountable. And then there is a bill that's filed by Senator Carroll in Embry, Senate Bill 80, that to me actually does some work toward holding police officers accountable. They're providing some definitions or amending some definitions on, their professional behavior. It's offering, creating a new section to allow law enforcement agencies to make an offer of conditional employment pending an investigation. It talks about, officer certification status and out-of-state enforcement agencies. So I think, that bill, it's a lot in it. So I haven't gone through it, with a fine-tooth comb, but I have seen some promising things in there that hold police in the state accountable for if they are doing things wrong or if they're doing things intentionally wrong, and that they can be held accountable differently than they are currently being held accountable. So I will shut up. I know that we have a Q&A time later, and maybe we can talk more about some of this stuff then. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dawson-Edwards. Yes, I gave you all too little time to dig into these really important issues. And so, yeah, while I would like to save some time for the end, I really appreciate your comments, everything you said. So I'm going to jump into introducing our next guest, who is Dustin Pugl, my colleague. Dustin's a senior policy analyst at the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, where he focuses on health policy and safety net programs. Dustin previously worked for BUILD in Lexington, where he trained congregations to identify, research, and advocate for policy solutions on a local level, and has done policy research for the Commonwealth Council on Developmental Disabilities. He has a BA in history from Asbury and a master's in public administration from the University of Kentucky. So thanks again, Dustin, and it's over to you.
Great, thank you. I have two really phenomenal speakers to follow, so that's not intimidating at all. I am going to try and move quickly so that we have some time for questions at the end. As I do that, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, because I'm not going to spend too much time so that Erica has a chance to share her good work too as well. So I want to talk a little bit today about race equity in the safety net and the ways that our safety net programs have improved race equity, but also the ways that we can build on them. And I want to begin with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. as today is his birthday and the national holiday is coming up on Monday, from a book, actually the last book that he wrote called Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos? And he said that the prescription for the cure rests with the accurate diagnosis of the disease. A people who began a national life inspired by a vision of a society of brotherhood can redeem itself, but redemption can only come through a humble acknowledgement of guilt and an honest knowledge of self. So I want to start a little bit today by exploring this honest knowledge of self and where we are as a state, and where we need to go from here. So just as a brief overview of some economic indicators that Pastor Palmer did a good job offering up earlier, but I just want to reiterate on a state level. In Kentucky, the labor force participation rate among Black and Hispanic or Latino Kentuckians is actually higher than that of the average, and it's higher than that of white Kentuckians. So they participate in the workforce at a higher rate, but their unemployment rate is higher. So there are a larger share of Black and Hispanic Kentuckians who are currently looking for work, or were in 2019, which is when all this data is from. The poverty rate for Black and Hispanic Kentuckians is much higher. Median wages are lower for Black Kentuckians. I don't have data for Hispanic Kentuckians. So, all this to say that we are not living in a world where race equity, which is the point at which race becomes a meaningless predictor of outcomes, exists. We live in a society where race equity continues, and it continues based off of historical and structural barriers that are the legacy of things like slavery and the so-called Southern Redemption and Jim Crow, law and order politics, mass incarceration, and really the ways that things like intergenerational income mobility have cemented those policies and the lack of good anti-racist policies to reverse them. As Pastor Palmer said earlier, we have made some progress, but we still live in a world where things like COVID-19 and the subsequent recession have really laid bare just how serious these disparities are, and how precarious a position we have left our brothers and sisters. So I do think, though, that there have been some ways that we have created programs that have really helped to address racial disparity. And I want to start with unemployment insurance, which I highlight as sort of a good news, bad news situation, in that Black Kentuckians have been able to use unemployment insurance at a higher rate. So it actually, as a safety net, it's technically a social insurance program, but as a program that's designed to catch people when they're laid off through no fault of their own, there is a higher rate of usage among Black Kentuckians than white Kentuckians. The bad news about that is obviously that Black Kentuckians have been laid off at a higher rate. So we end up with a really dangerous situation where white Kentuckians have been hired back at a higher rate. It's been easier for them to find work. Employers have been hiring back white Kentuckians, but Black Kentuckians, it's been longer for them. And so additionally, regular state UI, not the special programs through the CARES Act, but regular state UI, which is what we normally use, really leaves out many low income and part-time workers. So our monetary eligibility structure, the way we determine who's eligible for Medicaid based off pay history, leaves out a lot of folks who are low income and have inconsistent work histories. Good cause for separation. So, the reason somebody left their job don't necessarily include workplace harassment, which we know is a very real situation for many Kentuckians of color. It also doesn't allow part-time work. It doesn't allow benefits to part-time workers who are looking for part-time work, which is more often the case for folks who have caretaking responsibilities at home. And often that is the case for low-income workers, and especially Kentuckians of color and Black Kentuckians. We also have a really important program in SNAP, which not only helps to address hunger, it's actually a very important anti-recession tool in that it both helps to put food on the table, but it also helps free up family resources so that those can be used on other really important things like rent. We know that there's a really enormous rental crisis in the country and in Kentucky right now. So offering SNAP has been very helpful to helping families make ends meet, including by keeping food in the fridge. And again, much like unemployment insurance, it's sort of a good news, bad news situation. It has been there for Kentuckians of color at a higher rate than white Kentuckians, but that's again due to this legacy of inequity that we have inherited and that we haven't adequately addressed. Not only are those disparities real in the labor market, which leads to a higher participation in SNAP, it's also true that many low-income Kentuckians, and as we've seen, that includes a large share of Black Kentuckians, were initially left out of the max allotment when we increased that for folks due to COVID-19. Now, the most recent aid bill that was passed helps address that by increasing SNAP benefits by 15%. But it, in many cases, was too little too late. And a lot of people suffered needlessly because we weren't willing to do that sooner. There's also evidence that when there is a problem with someone's benefits and they are flagged for fraud, white Kentuckians tend to be sort of given a pass as having committed some sort of error that can be overlooked and they can move on, whereas Black Kentuckians get charged with fraud and often lose their benefits. There's no meaningful difference between the types of errors that are created. It's just a baked in problem with the way that we address our public benefits program. And additionally, I don't have it on the slide, but we know that the drug felony ban since 2018 has left nearly 7,000 Kentuckians without benefits. And a larger share of those, as you might imagine, based again on what Dr. Dawson-Edwards and Pastor Palmer mentioned, is due to disproportionate minority contact in the criminal justice system and a mass incarceration crisis that has been growing for far too long. And so we've left many people who are trying to re-enter society without the kind of aid that they need to be set up for success, because we feel that for some reason in Kentucky, if you have been convicted of a drug felony, you're unworthy of receiving food assistance. Medicaid is the last program I want to highlight. Medicaid is obviously like unemployment and SNAP. It's a program that's governed by both the federal and state government. And so there are options that states can do. And Kentucky took up maybe the most important option, which is expanding Medicaid coverage to all adults who are at or below 138% of poverty, which is about $17,000 for an individual. Medicaid expansion, as you can see from this chart here, really was a success story in achieving race equity in coverage rates in Kentucky. So we went from a pretty significant disparity in 2011, 2012, and 2013 prior to Medicaid expansion. And then that gap significantly narrowed in 2014 and was almost closed in 2015 when a new administration came in and rolled out what we might call unwelcome barriers to coverage, as well as attempting to strip coverage from 100,000 Kentuckians through a requirement that you prove your work in order to keep your Medicaid. And that created a lot of confusion. We know from research out of Harvard that a lot of folks walked away from Medicaid thinking that they no longer qualified, whereas in reality, they always qualified. But because of a lot of these policies, that disparity between Black and white Kentuckians has begun to grow again. And that's something that we really need to address. That has begun to be addressed through a new program because of COVID called presumptive eligibility, which allows folks to very easily and quickly sign up for Medicaid coverage, and then from within the Medicaid program move to a more sustainable type of coverage with Medicaid. Through the governor's commitment to cover all Black Kentuckians with his 1, 2, 3 no cost to me campaign in primarily or in largely Black and Hispanic communities throughout the state. But really, as I mentioned before, Medicaid expansion has been the hero of this story and has made the biggest difference. And if we want to continue to make sure that we achieve health equity and coverage, we need to make sure that we protect Medicaid and continue to enhance public coverage options for all Kentuckians. So I just want to finish quickly by saying really the same thing that the other presenters have said so far, which is that what the General Assembly does really does matter when it comes to achieving health equity and economic security throughout the Commonwealth. Like in all areas of public policy, racial and ethnic impacts have to be considered. I'm encouraged by proposed legislation to make a permanent committee that analyzes this and considers it. But there are other opportunities that we have to do this, such as Senator Neal's bill to require racial impact statements for certain types of legislation. And this should also be done on the administrative level. Anytime there are administrative changes, those can and often do have disparate impacts on people by race and ethnicity. And so we need to really make sure that those types of things are happening at the administrative level. It's also important to remember that any cuts to the safety net, including unemployment insurance, will leave Black and Hispanic Kentuckians, and indeed any Kentuckian color, to fall through the cracks first and furthest. There have been several attempts to do this in the past by limiting who can use unemployment insurance, limiting the amount of time that it can be used, or limiting or cutting the actual benefit itself, or in the safety net programs such as Medicaid, SNAP, and TANF in House Bills 3 and then 1 in the 2019 and 2020 sessions. There were significant concerns that we had about the ways that these safety net cuts would especially harm the Kentuckians of color throughout the state. We just need to acknowledge and be mindful of the fact that anytime you try and cut these programs, everyone will suffer, but Kentuckians of color will suffer first and they'll fall the furthest. It's also important to realize that any improvements to the safety net, especially when we aim those improvements at achieving equity, will help everyone, because at some point we're all going to fall in hard times. We're an interconnected community. And so when we try and make sure that the folks who have been historically left out of economic opportunity are the ones that we're focusing on, everyone benefits. And Anna in the past has brought up this idea of curb cuts in the disability community. When we really pushed for making sure that these ramps off of sidewalks were available for folks within the disability community, it ended up really helping everyone. It helped, parents pushing strollers. It helped delivery men. It helped cyclists. It helped children who were riding their bikes. and just walking. So when we really consider our safety net and other opportunities for economic security as an opportunity for the same kind of success we saw with curb cuts, we really end up helping everyone, but we obviously are able to close economic gaps for racial groups. And then finally, I just want to say that pro-worker policies are anti-racist policies. So when we do things like increase the minimum wage, when we implement paid family and sick leave, when we pursue pro-union laws, we're really helping everyone. But again, we're really making sure that we're closing the economic gaps that exist based off these structural barriers that have not been fully addressed yet. And I want to finish again, bookending my time here with some words from Dr. King, which is never a bad idea, that there's nothing new about poverty. What is new, however, is that we have the resources to get rid of it. There's no deficit in human resources. The deficit is in human will. So for those of us Kentuckians who continue to advocate in the General Assembly as our session continues, I really just encourage us all to overcome the deficit of human will and pursue policies that work for everyone. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back over to Anna.
Thank you, Dustin. I have to give credit where credit is due. Angela Glover Blackwell from Policy Link is who I learned about curb cuts from, and she's written beautifully on this idea that we don't have a trickle down economy, we have a cascade up economy. So I really recommend her writing to our audience. I now have the pleasure of introducing our final panel guest today. Erica Williams is Vice President for State Fiscal Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. In this role, she helps lead the organization and its 40-person State Fiscal Policy Division and supports progress of the State Priorities Partnership, a network of state-level policy shops like KY Policy, advancing racial, gender, and economic justice. Williams brings a deep commitment to state-level infrastructure and policy efforts that break down barriers to opportunity and enable all communities to thrive. She oversees several equity-focused initiatives, including on state EITCs, that's the Earned Income Tax Credit, poverty reduction, and immigration. So handing it over to you, Erica. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Anna, and thanks to everybody who has given us so much to think about today. It's great to be with you. I was thinking about what Pastor Palmer said at the beginning of this time together, that people are asking this question or making this statement about how un-American what we've been experiencing is, and how could this be happening? And the truth is, it is all too American. And I think the question in front of us is, do we want to be this America, or do we want to build toward the multiracial democracy of our highest ideals? And if the answer to that question is yes, to that second question is yes, then we have a lot of work to do. We really need to roll up our sleeves and get busy moving anti-racist policies, as he said. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the landscape looks like for states in particular, the racially disparate effects of the crisis we're in, and offer 3 principles for an anti-racist equitable state response to the world we're living in right now. And that can really help us chart a course to a just recovery and future that extends to all people. So, there's a lot of need out there right now, as we know, and states have faced really big costs in seeking to contain the virus as it's sort of raged across our communities, and as more people turn to Medicaid, unemployment insurance, and other forms of assistance that are helping them to get by right now. And at the same time, in a lot of states, revenues have really taken a deep dive, and it varies some by states, but in aggregate, we're looking at state, local, and tribal government shortfalls of at least $300 billion between now and June 2022. And while that might change in the coming months, we've so far received little state fiscal relief to minimize public employee layoffs and cuts to key drivers of state budgets, our schools, our public system of higher education, our healthcare system, and economic supports that families and communities so desperately need right now. States and localities have furloughed or laid off about 1.4 million workers since COVID hit, eclipsing what we saw during the Great Recession, which was a doozy of a recession. It was bad enough. I think here in Kentucky, about 30,000 state and local jobs have been lost. So it's no small thing. And you know, as you've heard, the effects of this crisis have been incredibly uneven. People of color have been disproportionately affected in terms of infections and hospitalizations, and among Black people in some Native communities, they've experienced highly disproportionate death rates. Here in the District of Columbia, where I live, 75% of COVID deaths are, you know, deaths borne by Black people. And, you know, people of color are also overrepresented in the jobs that put them at higher risk of infection and in the jobs hardest economically. You can see here that the light blue line at the top, those are folks in Kentucky earning more than $60,000 who have seen their employment come back above pre-pandemic levels. That dark blue line at the bottom is folks who earn less than $27,000, and you can see they are nowhere near recovering their employment levels back to pre-pandemic levels. So there's disparate effects here, and it's causing deep hardship. You know, Black and Latino households are much more likely right now to be experiencing, you know, hunger, not having enough food in the home. In Kentucky, 1/5 of adults in homes with kids say they can't afford enough food. And if those racial disparities follow through to Kentucky, which there's no reason to think they wouldn't, then that means people of color in the state of Kentucky are feeling that hardship most acutely. And this, of course, comes along atop long-standing structural barriers like wealth and income disparities, inadequate access to health care, and racial discrimination that's built into our health system and our labor market, right? So already Black and Latinx people were more likely to earn poverty wages, and women have been more likely to be in low-wage work. Already, white households own 87% of all wealth in this country, 87%. And the top 10% of white households own 2/3 of all wealth. That leaves 13% for everybody else. Already, states and localities are asking more as a share of income in state and local taxes than folks at the top. You can see here in Kentucky, everybody's paying more in state and local taxes as a share of their income than the top 1%. So we've got real upside down systems, and we've got racial disparities baked in. And those are making this moment just that much more dire. And all that's to say that Kentucky, like other states, they have critical policy choices to make right now. You know, to repeat and exacerbate these inequities that I've mentioned, which will also do damage to the economy, or to set another course toward an anti-racist, equitable economic recovery. You know, we can't go back to normal. Normal doesn't work, never did. Doesn't work for Black and brown communities, for immigrants, or Indigenous people, or anyone stuck in a low-paid job, right? Normal doesn't work for the economy writ large, as we leave talent and potential untapped and on the table by under-resourcing and underserving large swaths of the population, Black, brown, and white. And in fact, research that we've just put out shows that if we were able to eliminate racial, gender, and income inequality in this country, we'd have 4 times more kids growing up to be inventors and innovators, solving our biggest problems and driving our growth and the jobs of the future. And you can see a little bit here. You'll get these slides later, so don't feel like you have to read them. In Kentucky, you'd have 3 times more kids growing up to be inventors and innovators. And that's why we need to chart a new course. And we've laid out 3 principles for doing that. I'm going to touch on each of them. The first is to target aid to those most in need due to the health and economic crisis. Our immediate policy response right now really needs to be supporting folks who are on the front lines of this crisis, essential workers, folks that are putting themselves on the line every day. A lot of Black and brown people who are still going out there in public and going to work, as well as people who, because of historic and ongoing bias and discrimination, experienced health and economic insecurity before this crisis began. And they've always faced major barriers to work and have struggled on low pay. So that includes things like serving people who are homeless, making sure that we are providing safe shelter for folks, freezing evictions for as long as economic conditions demand, and maybe even helping to support landlords so that we're not having folks amassing debt during the crisis that they're not going to be able to pay off when things get better. We need to be, and just to make it clear, folks who have lost income due to COVID are much more likely to not be caught up on rent or to not be confident that they can pay next month's rent. And these are the folks that are at risk of becoming homeless right now. We need to be doing things like ensuring broadband access for our kids in the K-12 system, for college students who are unable to afford internet services or who are in remote and rural areas, including students living on tribal reservations, where those services are just unavailable. We need to be providing childcare to essential workers so that they have their kids in safe, quality locations while they're working. And we need to be releasing youth from detention centers that are putting them at high risk right now of contracting the virus, among many other things. Our second principle is to advance anti-racist equitable policies to dismantle those persistent inequities that we talked about. You know, states really can take advantage of this moment to address inequities that are born out of historical racism and ongoing bias and discrimination that has led to persistent disparities and vulnerabilities, even in good times, right? Black unemployment is roughly twice as high as white unemployment on average over time, whether good times or bad. And it's not much better in the best of times than white unemployment is in the worst of times. Those are things that we can address right now. And states can push against this in various ways. One thing they can do is, as Dustin talked about, make unemployment benefits more robust and expand who has access to them, make sure people aren't falling through the cracks when we have recessions. They can also be, you know, this is a really good time for folks to go to school. And recessions are a great time for people to go and get an education if they can. States should be helping to make that happen by holding down tuition costs for low-income students, prioritizing funding for regional colleges that are serving more students from lower income areas, including in rural communities and students of color. They can also prioritize need-based aid above merit-based programs that tend to direct resources to college students who are from more privileged backgrounds, right? And states, you know, we know from the Great Recession, states slashed into public higher education, funding for public higher education, putting more of the responsibility for the cost of going to college or community college on students and their families. And we know, for example, in this slide, you can see here that because of disparities in earnings by race and ethnicity and the discrimination that we see in the labor market, kids of color are the share of their income that they have to spend to get to college, to go to college, is much higher than for white families. So that's another thing we can do. And we also need to take a look at eliminating criminal legal fees and base fines on ability to pay. We saw over the Great Recession, localities really ramp up their reliance on fees and fines to pay for local government services, to pay for our courts, right? And you're really tracking, it's a very extractive way to pay for public services that's disproportionately fallen on the shoulders of Black and Brown communities, and also can lead to people losing their licenses and not being able to get to work. Their driver's licenses. It can lead to people being jailed for being poor, basically, not being able to pay those fees and fines. It's very extractive. It's very inequitable and something we need to reverse course on. Our third principle is to protect state finances to preserve long-term growth and to ensure our opportunity. We saw what happened during the Great Recession. States slashed their school spending. They slashed spending on public systems of higher education. They slashed spending for infrastructure, leaving us with crumbling schools and hospitals and roads. And we haven't really seen any of that funding come back. It's not been restored across states broadly. And while those policy choices, that choice to cut rather than raise revenue was made hard for a lot of people across racial and ethnic categories, people of color felt that harm most acutely because, as you saw before, they're less likely to have wealth to fall back on when hard times hit like that. They're more likely to be living in communities that have been neglected and underserved over decades and decades. And so we really need to do different this time and find ways to make sure that we're staving off cuts and staving off public employee layoffs. So states can make full use of their rainy day funds right now. This is what they're for. This is a rainy day. If this isn't a rainy day, I don't know what is. They can roll back economic development incentives and corporate tax loopholes that aren't producing the bang for the buck. The research is not there supporting that kind of use of public dollars. They can also raise revenue, particularly from folks who are wealthy and profitable corporations that are doing just fine in this economy. I have a slide here showing where states have real estate transfer taxes or statewide property taxes that could be made more equitable, more progressive, where you could levy higher taxes, assess higher taxes on higher income properties and homes. And so that's something that Kentucky could take a look at. But there are lots of other ways we can improve our income tax systems and make sure that we're asking the most of those who are doing the best in our economy today and since the beginning of time, right? And make sure that corporations are actually paying their share for the benefits they're getting from us. So, all that is to say that this is a really consequential moment. What states do is going to have implications for decades to come. If we're not intentional about undoing past harms and ongoing harms, then we are at best maintaining the status quo, and at worst, we're exacerbating the harms of past discriminatory policies and practices. I think the good news here is that if intentional policy choices can create persistent inequities, then they can also undo them, and they can help us chart that course to the anti-racist, equitable future that we want and need. And this is, I think, what we have to remain laser focused on in our current context. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for your participation, for our panelists, for all the rich insights and information and thoughtfulness that you've given us today. All of our guests for your attendance and your commitment, and to everybody for your grace around the technical difficulties that we experienced today, and for us not having time for questions. I do just want to leave us on a few parting thoughts. Dr. Dawson-Edwards was saying, we have data, we have proof. She's less interested in solely focusing on that. I often also hear in my role as communications director for KY policy, what are the talking points? We also have those. And we're in the business of data and talking points. That's what we do, and there's a role for it. But we need more. We also have all of these crises that are laying bare our structural racism. We have proof, we have data, we know how to talk about these issues. And so this question about how do we move forward? We can't go back to normal. Erica mentioned, going back to normal after this crisis doesn't work. It doesn't work for anybody, especially doesn't work for people of color. So I will leave you with a question that came to us from one of our guests, my colleague, Carmen Mitchell. Carmen asks, the US seems to go through cycles where we have major opportunities to move forward, like abolishing slavery, Reconstruction, and the civil rights movement in the 1960s, only to end up not making much progress as we want, or even going backwards on issues like criminal justice and economic equality. What can we do as a public to make sure this moment in racial and social justice reckoning we are having now leads to more permanent positive change? This is a question for all of us. I know we're here because we wrestle this. So I just wanted to frame it up again for everybody before we sign off for the day. I appreciate you all so much, and that's it. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.